بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is our fourth lesson, that's lesson number 4 on the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah, which is by Sheikh Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And this book that we are studying is basically a summary of the book of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah at-Tadmuriyyah. So in the preceding 3 lessons we went through the introduction. In the introduction, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he basically provided some historical background relating to the splitting of the Muslim nation, the appearance of different groups, different sects, different doctrines, different beliefs. And at the end of that introduction, he established that Allah Azza wa Jal, He creates or He brings about what opposes the truth in order to make the truth to be apparent. Right? So if there wasn't falsehood, we would not know truth. Just like with everything else, we see things occur in pairs. If there wasn't, pain, there wouldn't be pleasure. If there wasn't sadness and misery, there wouldn't be happiness. Right? If there wasn't bitterness, there wouldn't be sweetness, and so on and so forth. So by the opposites are things made clear. So falsehood and the multiplication of different types of falsehood, through that we can see the clarity of the truth. And the Shaykh gave some similitudes of, for example, gold, and how gold is mixed with ore, and when the gold is heated, when it's put to trial, when it's heated, we see that the gold comes out pure, and all of the impurities are separated and are removed. So this happens by way of the people of truth. Allah Azza wa Jal establishes scholars, He establishes people who will clarify the truth and explain truth from falsehood. And this has happened, always happened throughout history, throughout the ages, in all the centuries. And from those scholars is Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, who in the 7th century after Hijrah, according to the Muslim calendar, he came and he authored many works and refutations and clarifications of basically every group or sect you can think of, even the Jews, the Christians, the philosophers, the atheists, the logicians, the Greek philosophers, the Greek logicians, the Sufis, the Ittihadis, the Khawarij, the Rafida, all of the people of Kalam, which is our topic in this book, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, and he established the truth by way of that. And so after that introduction, after introducing the author of the book, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah then went on to explain what was the reason behind the authorship of the book. And the reason was that many of the associates and the students of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah asked him to put into writing those things that they had heard him frequently speak about on this topic. So in frequent discussions, frequent sittings, they said, could you put all of that together into a book form? And so this book, Tadmuriyyah, is the result of that. And this book, as we said, it deals with 2 topics. The first is the attributes of Allah. How do we believe in the attributes of Allah? And the second is to do with al-qadr, the divine decree, and Allah's legislation, right? And how there is no conflict between Allah legislating things for us to do or not to do, and between Allah decreeing all things, right? All things being from His knowledge, from His decree, from His will, from His creation. There's no conflict between those two things. And so that's the second half of the book. And the first half of the book is the issue of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the second half of the third lesson, we began the main text of the book. And in the main text of the book, in the opening paragraph, we established one principle, which is, and in fact, before we established that principle, we first of all looked at language, kalam. All of speech, in all languages, it divides into two categories. It is either khabar, it is either merely conveying information, or it is a request, a talab, which means a command or a prohibition. Right? So all the speech of a man, all the speech of everyone, every person, is either khabar or it is talab. Right? So once we understand that, then when we look at the Quran, the revelation of Allah Azza wa Jal, then in the Quran, which is from Allah Azza wa Jal, we are either receiving a khabar or we are receiving a talab, a request. And to each of these two things, there are different obligations, right? So with respect to the khabar, which is Allah Azza wa Jal informing us of something, whether that is about Himself, whether that is about the unseen, meaning the stories of the past which we never witnessed, whether it is what comes after death, of the grave, resurrection, paradise, hellfire, the recompense. So all of these akhbar, these reports or this information, then from the point of view of the listener, which is the creation, right? This is responded to either by way of tasdeeq, which is belief, or it is taqreeb, which is disbelief, right? So this is the nature of a report. A report is either believed or it is disbelieved, right? So the topic of Allah's names and His attributes, Allah's names and attributes, it is khabar. It is pure information. It is pure report from Allah Azza wa Jal. And this report, which we see throughout the whole of the Quran, it informs us as to what is obligatory for Allah, of His tawheed, meaning that He is singled out, He's unique in His right to be worshipped, and the fact that He has perfect attributes, and certain things which are impossible for Him. Right? It is impossible for Him to have a partner who deserves or is given worship alongside Him. It is impossible for Him to have a naqs, any deficiency, and to have any resemblance or likeness between Himself and the creation in terms of the realities of His attributes. Right? All of these are impossibilities. So the Quran, in the information which it conveys, which is the khabar, then this is what it conveys to us about Allah Azza wa Jal Himself. Right? So this is all from the bab of al-khabar. So when we listen to it, we can respond to it either with tasdeeq, which is belief and acceptance, or it is taqdeeb, which is rejection and disbelief. We looked at some evidences for that. Ayatul Kursi, which is the chapter 2, verse 255, is an excellent example of where we can see Allah Azza wa Jal affirming things for Himself and negating things for Himself. So that's what we covered in the previous lesson. So today's lesson, lesson 4, starts from this point onwards. So as you recall, we said that speech is either khabar or it is talab. So we've dealt with the first half. The first half is khabar, and now we're going to deal very briefly with the second half, which is at-talab, which is the request. So Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, وَأَمَّا الْكَلَامِ فِي الشَّرْعِ وَالْقَدَرِ وَأَمَّا الْكَلَامِ فِي الشَّرْعِ وَالْقَدَرِ. As for the speech about Allah's legislation and His decree. Right, so this is now the legislation of Allah, the commands, the prohibitions, and also the decree. فَهُوَ مِنْ بَابِ الطَّلَبِ الدَّائِرْ بَيْنَ الْأَمْرِ وَالنَّهِي مِنْ قِبَلِ الْمُتَكَلِّمِ. So he says, as for speech regarding the legislation and the decree, the destiny decree, then this is from the angle of a talab. This is from the angle of a request that is being made. And this request revolves between either a command or a prohibition from the angle of the speaker. So the speaker, who is Allah in the Quran, right? It is a command or a prohibition. المقابل بالطاعة أو المعصية من قبل المخاطب. And it is responded to either by obedience or disobedience on behalf of the one who is the respondent, the one who is being spoken to. Right? So the speaker is the one who makes the command or the prohibition, and the one being addressed, which is us, we either obey or we disobey. Right? It is obedience or disobedience. And he continues, لأن المطلوب, because the thing being requested, which is either a command or a prohibition, is either beloved to Allah and His Messenger. It is a thing that is beloved to Allah and His Messenger, which means it is commanded, or it is something which is disliked by Allah and His Messenger, which means that it is prohibited against. Right? So in other words, putting this paragraph together, the speaker who here is Allah Azza wa Jal, who is speaking the Quran to us, and in this Quran there is khabar, which we've already discussed, and there is talab. And talab is a request, and the request is either a command or a prohibition. And a command is only commanded because Allah loves it. Allah loves what is commanded. Allah is pleased with it, and because there is benefit, there's rectification in it, and there's good in it. So Allah loves it and Allah commands it. And what is prohibited, it is prohibited because Allah dislikes it. Allah hates it, because within it is evil and harm and corruption and so on and so forth. And so therefore, those who are being addressed, which is the creation, they respond either with obedience or with disobedience. Right, so now the Shaykh gives an example of this from the Quran to illustrate this. And the example here is from Surah An-Nisa, the 4th chapter, verse number 36, in which Allah says, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهِ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Very clear. وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهِ, worship Allah alone. So this clearly is a command. Allah has commanded the worship of Him alone, because the worship of Him alone is truth, it is justice, it is rectification. When you single out Allah in worship, you are in service, in servitude to Him alone. It means you are saved from enslavement to everything else. Right? You are saved from enslavement to your desires, to shaitan, to people. Right? You are freed from enslavement by worshipping Allah alone. So Allah loves it, and so Allah has commanded it here. And then He said, وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا, and do not associate anything with Him in worship, meaning do not worship anything alongside Him. Why? Because within that is corruption, it is injustice, it is evil, and so on and so forth. So وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهِ is a command to the worship of Allah, And وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا, do not associate anything with him, is a prohibition from shirk or polytheism or idolatry or worshipping other things alongside Allah Azza wa Jal. So the Shaykh goes on to explain, وَالْفَرْقِ بَيْنَ الْخَبَرِ وَالطَّلَبِ فِي حَقِيقَتِهِمَا وَحُكْمِهِمَا مَعْلُومٌ. He says the difference between a khabar, which is a report, and a talab, which is a request, as regards to the reality of these two things and their ruling, this is known, right? This is something that is clearly known, right? So the Shaykh actually illustrates this in his explanation. Let me explain to you the difference between khabar and talab. If someone said to you, stand up, if someone said to you, stand up, and you said to him, you've spoken the truth. Right? If someone said to you, qum, and you said, sadaqt, you've spoken the truth, right? Then this is wrong. Because when someone gives you a command or a prohibition, you don't respond by saying, you've spoken truthfully. Right? Like for example, you have your parents say, do such and such. And then you say, you've spoken the truth. This doesn't make any sense. Because this is a talab, this is a request. And with a request is only met with either obedience or disobedience. Right? You don't say, yes, you've spoken the truth. This is wrong. And so that's the difference between a khabar and a talab. With a khabar, with a report, you say, if I said to you, so-and-so person is stood outside, you can say to me, sadaqt aw kadhabt. You can say you've spoken truthfully or you're incorrect. You've erred or you're lying. Right? This is a khabar. This is how you respond to a khabar. It is either acceptance or rejection. But with a command or a prohibition, it is either imtithal, it is, you fulfill what you've been asked to do, or you don't, or you disobey. So the difference between al-khabar wa talab is very, very clear and apparent. And as the Shaykh says, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, that al-talab, a request, is responded to either with obedience or with disobedience. And we don't say in response to a command or a prohibition, like if Allah says in the Quran, establish the prayer. Establish the prayer. We don't say Allah has spoken truthfully. We actually do what we've been ordered to do. We establish the prayer. And the same with everything else, righteousness to parents and so on and so forth. So the Shaykh goes on to say, it's as Ibn Taymiyyah said, that this is ma'lumun likulli ahad. This difference between the report and the request, report is khabar and the request is the talab, this difference is known by everybody. Ma'lumun likulli, it's known to everybody. And the Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen says, this is known even to children. This difference is known even to children. Because if you said to a child, for example, idhab wa ahdir kada wa kada, if you said to the child, go and do such and such, or whatever, he would then just simply go and do what you told him, because he knows what is a command. But if you said to him, ja'at ummuk aw abuk, if you say to him, oh look, your father's here or your mother's here, your mother's come, your father's come, then he will start rejoicing, he'll be happy, right? And he'll be really happy, because intrinsically he knows the difference between a khabar and a talab, right? He knows the difference between a report and between a request. So in other words, up until this point, what Ibn Taymiyyah is doing in this opening section is really laying down the foundations for the two topics he is going to address in this book, right? The first half of the book, he is addressing the issue of Allah's names and his attributes, right? Under which principle does Allah's names and his attributes come under? It is under the principle of the report, the khabar, right? The khabar. It's from a report because, as we said, the intellect on its own is not sufficient to acquire detailed knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And to attempt to do so is futile. You will enter into misguidance as many nations of the past entered into misguidance, right? Yes, the intellect can derive some knowledge about Allah at a basic level, that he exists, obviously, that he's knowledgeable, that he's powerful, that he's wise, that he has will, and and so on and so forth. Some things that we can deduce. So the intellect can do that, but it cannot have detailed knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, the central foundational principle is the khabar, the report, right? This is very different to the people of philosophy, the Greek philosophers and whoever followed in their path, because what they say that the way you start is that you erase everything from your mind, you erase everything from your heart, you start from a clean slate, and then you build knowledge, right? And in this, they don't distinguish between knowledge of the world and knowledge of, what is beyond the world, right? Knowledge of the creator and the unseen. So they enter into confusion, right? And so Muslims followed them in that, and they made that to be the underlying principle, to make reason to be the foundation, not revelation to be the foundation, right? And this is why this book has been authored, because many sects, groups, splits, differences, controversies appeared specifically because of that mistake. So what Ibn Taymiyyah is doing in this opening to the book is explaining to us that the topic of the attributes, which is the first half of the book, comes under the subject matter of the khabar, the report. That's the underlying principle. And as for the topic of the second half of the book, which is al-qadar, and the legislation of Allah and the decree, and this is like when someone says, well, if Allah wanted me to pray, then I would have prayed. If Allah didn't want me to drink, then I wouldn't have drunk, right? You probably heard these types of arguments, right? So this is when people they try to use Allah's decree as an argument against his legislation, right? You often find the sinful people doing this. Well, if Allah wanted me to pray, then I would have prayed. If Allah didn't want me to smoke, then I wouldn't have smoked. This is a futile. This is a topic that's going to be discussed in the second half of the book. What principle does that come under? The principle to do with the legislation and the qadar. Well, it is the topic of at-talab, the request. And notice how these two in turn go back to language, the speech, the kalam. Kalam is either khabar or it is talab. So here in this paragraph, what we've been through today, Ibn Taymiyyah is explaining again that with respect to Allah's legislation, which is talab, it is responded to either with obedience or with disobedience, right? So we have two different obligations, right? An obligation in relation to Allah's names and attributes, an obligation in relation to his legislation. So next, what the Shaykh explains is he explains these two obligations. So he says, فالواجب على العباد إزاء خبر الله ورسوله التصديق والإيمان به على ما أراد الله ورسوله تصديقا لا تكذيب معه وإيمانا لا كفر معه ويقينا لا شك معه. Right? So basically, in this sentence, he's saying that what is obligatory upon the servants of Allah with respect to Allah's report, Allah's khabar, and the messenger's khabar is at-tasdeeq, which is acceptance, wal-iman, which is belief, على ما أراد الله ورسوله, upon however Allah intended it and His Messenger intended it, with such a belief in which there is no rejection, and with such faith in which there is no disbelief, and with such certainty in which there is no doubt, right? So look at all of these descriptions of the way that we accept the report of Allah Azza wa Jal, meaning the Quran. The Quran is within it is the akhbar. And who is more truthful than Allah in speech? Right? Who is more truthful than Allah in speech? So the way that we respond to it is tasdeeq, belief, al-iman, and yaqeen, which is acceptance, belief, and certainty, without any doubt or anything like that. Then he brings an ayah from the Quran, a verse in the Quran, in which Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, aminu billahi wa rasulih, wal kitabi alladhi nazzala ala rasulihi, wal kitabi alladhi anzala min qabl, ومن يكفر بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا. O you who believe, believe in Allah and His Messenger. O you who believe, believe in Allah and His Messenger, and the book which He revealed upon His Messenger, and the book which He revealed before. And whoever disbelieves in Allah and His angels and His books and His messengers and the last day, then he has gone far, far astray. Right? So this verse is a proof of the obligation to believe in whatever Allah has informed us about. And in this verse, which is in Surah An-Nisa, the 4th chapter, verse 136, in this verse you can also see 5 of the 6 pillars of Iman. 5 of the 6 pillars of Iman. In this verse there is mention of Allah, the angels, the books, the messengers, and the last day. And obviously the 6th pillar is Al-Qadr, the divine decree. And so these are the pillars of Iman, and these are things of which we are informed, of which Allah has brought us akhbar, about Himself, about the angels, about the books, the messengers, and the last day. Alright, so these are things that we believe in. And at the beginning of the verse, Allah says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, aminu billah wa rasulih. O you who believe, believe in Allah and His Messenger. There's a question that the Shaykh mentions here as well, which is, why in this verse does Allah say, O you who believe, and then command us to believe in Allah and His Messenger? If we are already believers, O you who believe, then why follow it with a command to believe in Allah and His Messenger? And the answer, or the explanation to that, is that in this verse, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, the first mention of belief, O you who believe, alludes to a general belief. O you who have believed with a generalized belief. Right? O you who have believed with a generalized belief, with Iman mujmal. Right? And then what follows is a command to have Iman mufassal, to have a detailed belief, right? Meaning to have detailed knowledge of all of the affairs of belief in those things that we cannot directly see, right? Or that we haven't observed or witnessed directly, right? To believe in Allah, His angels, the books, the messengers, the last day, right? To have a detailed belief. So anyhow, this verse is a proof of the obligation to accept and believe and have certainty, right? To have tasdeeq and iman and yaqeen in whatever Allah has informed us about. The second obligation he then goes on to say, وَالْوَاجِبُ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ وَالْوَاجِبُ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ إِذَا طَلَبْ, what is obligatory to upon the servants with respect to the talab, with respect to the request, which is the command of the prohibition. امتثاله على الوجه الذي أراد الله ورسوله من غير غلو ولا تقصير فيؤمنون بالمأمور ويجتنبون المحظور. So what is obligatory upon the servants with respect to the request is to implement it, to fulfill it in the way that Allah and His Messenger intended. In the way that they intended. Right? Notice how there's a qualification for both the khabar and the talab. Both the khabar and the talab. Right? For the khabar is that we believe in it in the way that Allah intended it. Which means you can't now go and make a misinterpretation of the speech of Allah and believe in something that Allah did not intend. Right? You have to believe it in the way that Allah intended it. And likewise, when you act upon something that Allah commanded, then you act upon it in the way, you fulfill it in a way that Allah and His Messenger actually intended it. Without exaggeration, without extremism and exaggeration, and without neglect, without falling short. Right? So therefore, what do? We fulfill that which is commanded, and we abandon and we avoid that which is prohibited. And what is the evidence? What is the evidence from the Quran for this obligation with respect to the talab, the request of Allah? Then it is the following speech of Allah Azza wa Jal, which is in Surah Al-Anfal, the 8th chapter, chapter number 8, verses 20 to 23. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله ورسوله أطيعوا الله ورسوله ولا تولوا عنه وأنتم تسمعون. O you who believe, obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not turn your backs away from Him whilst you are listening. ولا تكونوا كالذين قالوا سمعنا وهم لا يسمعون. And do not be like those who say, we have heard, yet they do not really, they have not really heard, they do not really listen. And then he says, إِنَّ شَرَّ الدَّوَّابِ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الصُّمُّ الْبُكْمُ الَّذِينَ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. Indeed, the most evil of creatures in the sight of Allah is the deaf and dumb, which does not understand. Right? The worst type of creature, the worst type of beast in the sight of Allah is the deaf and dumb, which does not understand. وَلَوْ عَلِمَ اللَّهُ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا لَأَسْمَعَهُمْ وَلَوْ أَسْمَعَهُمْ لَتَوَلَّوْا وَهُمْ مُعْرِضُونَ. And if Allah had known in them any goodness, then He would have made them to listen. And if He had made them to listen, they still would have turned their backs away. Right, so in short here, the way that a believer responds to the talab of Allah is to do what you have been commanded and to keep away from that which you've been prohibited upon the upon the way, or in a way that was intended by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, he comments on these 2 points that we just mentioned about the obligation is to believe in whatever Allah has informed us about. Now here a question arises: does merely accepting as true what Allah has informed us about, does that enter a person into Iman? Does that make a person a believer? Right? The Shaykh explains that merely believing that the messenger is the messenger, that is not sufficient for a person to enter him into Iman. And he gives an example. The Prophet's uncle, Abu Talib, he believed that his nephew that he was indeed the messenger of Allah. He accepted that. And, this was not sufficient to enter him into Islam. In fact, he even used to have lines of poetry, Abu Talib, in defense of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And, he says, لَقَدْ عَلِمُوا أَنَّ ابْنَنَا لَا مُكَذَّبٌ لَدَيْنَا وَلَا يُؤْنَى بِقَوْلِ الْأَبَاطِيلِ. Right? Speech which generally means that, these people have come to know that our son, meaning his nephew, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he's not denied by us, he's not considered a liar by us, and nor does he have any concern with false statements. And likewise he said, وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْتُ بِأَنَّ دِينَ مُحَمَّدٍ مِنْ خَيْرِ أَدْيَانِ الْبَرِيَّةِ دِينًا, that I have indeed come to know that the religion of Muhammad is from the best of the religions of the people in terms of a religion, the best. And he also said, لولا الملامة أو حذار مصبة لرأيتني سمحا بذاك مبينا, that had it not been for blame coming to me and for fear of being abused and reviled, then you would have seen me basically adopting that religion openly. So in other words, Abu Talib has made it very, very clear that I know my nephew is the messenger of Allah, I know he is truthful, I know he does not speak lies, I know his religion is the most superior and the best of all the religions of the people of the earth, but it's only because if I was to leave the way of my forefathers, my people would blame me, they would abuse me, they would revile me, and it would be considered to be an insult to my forefathers that I leave their religion. Right? That was his reason for not believing. And this shows that mere acceptance, tasdeeq, is not sufficient for a person to become a believer. Rather, there has to be an inward acceptance that one is obligated to act upon that knowledge. Right? This is like inqiyad. It's like inward compliance. So it's not just mere knowledge of something being true. It's actually the inward compliance with what that thing requires from you. This is why Iblis, is Iblis a believer? Iblis is not a believer, yet he knows Allah. He knows he knows Allah. He knows Allah. He knows there's paradise. He knows there's hellfire. He knows there's messengers. He knows there's books. He knows why we've been created. Right? He knows there's hellfire. He knows all these things with much more knowledge than what we have. But he's still a disbeliever. Why? It is because arrogance, kibr, prevented him from submission. Right? So tasdeeq is one thing, the mere acknowledgement and the mere acceptance. But the inner submission and the compliance is something else. That is what is needed for a person to enter into Iman alongside, verbal expression. Right, so this is why you see many people from the Jews, from the Christians, from other than them, they have come to the conclusion that it is impossible for Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam not to be a messenger, not to be a prophet, right? Because of what he has brought. What he has brought, the message to worship Allah alone, the law which he has brought, in which there is, every good and rectification and everything. They recognize that this cannot be, this has to be revelation, right? So they know that he is truthful. But they will then give reasons as to why, this does not enter them into Islam, right? This does not make them any, it does not enter them into Islam. And then they have multiple reasons as to why they're not willing to submit. It is, in the case of Abu Talib, I can't abandon the way of my forefathers for fear of rebuke and blame. For others it is, well, I can't let go of my lifestyle. I like the money, I like the women, I like the what they see to be freedom. It's not freedom, it's actually enslavement. It's not freedom, but what they see to be freedom, which to them is the pursuits of lusts and desires. Others, it could be fearing the loss of leadership and power, which is why many of the people, the hypocrites in Medina, they harbored disbelief, because they thought, hang on, who's this man come to our city, right? He's gathering followers, and we're going to lose power in the city. How, right? So they concealed disbelief, and then they tried all these political machinations to try and destroy the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So sometimes it is power, right? So people have different reasons: power, wealth, authority, lust, desires, fear of blame, whatever. Right? So here what they are doing is, this is the nature of kufr. Kufr is to conceal and bury the truth. Right? It is to prevent submission of the truth, which should come naturally. Once you know the messenger is truthful, the Quran is true, it is from Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? So Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he mentions that about Abu Talib, and he says a man can make tasdeeq, which means that he can accept certain things, but that does not make him to be a believer. Right, so this ends this particular opening section. Right, this opening section is simply an introduction to the book as a whole, the two parts to the book, the part about Allah's attributes and the part about Al-Qadr. So now we are going to move to the next section, the next fasl, and this is where we now start in detail looking at the principles, the rules and the principles to do with Allah's names and His attributes. So what we'll do for today's lesson, inshallah ta'ala, we'll read through the opening paragraph, the first paragraph, and then we'll leave the commentary for next lesson, inshallah ta'ala. So in the next section, page 15, if you have the book, the top of page 15, if you have the book, fasl, إِذَا تَبَيَّنَ ذَلِكَ فَهَاهُنَا أَصْلًا. So once this becomes clear, once you've understood what has preceded, then there are two principles that we should understand. There are two principles. Al-Aslu al-Awwal fi sifat. The first principle regarding the attributes, وَهُوَ أَن يُوصَفَ اللَّهُ بِمَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ وَبِمَا وَصَفَتْهُ بِهِ رُسُلُهُ إيمانا بلا تمثيل وتنزيها بلا تعطيل كما جمع الله تعالى بينهما في قوله ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. Okay, so he says here, the first principle regarding the attributes, which is that Allah is to be described with whatever He described Himself and with whatever His messengers described Him. So as we said before in the previous series of lessons, this is the foundational principle, right? So once we've established that when it comes to knowledge about Allah, His names and His attributes, this comes under the topic of, or the principle of, al-khabar. It is pure report, nothing else. It is purely being informed by Allah Azza wa Jal. And so the way this works is exactly how we've just mentioned it here, is that we affirm for Allah, or that we describe Allah with whatever He described Himself with, or what His messengers described Him with a faith, ithbatan, affirming it, but without likening it to the creation. So we affirm whatever Allah has told us of His attributes, but we don't liken it to the creation. And at the same time, we negate any likenesses to the creation, but without negating the attribute altogether. In other words, we are striking a balance in the middle. So what we are doing is we are saying Allah has said of himself that, for example, he hears and he sees. So we affirm the meaning that Allah hears and sees, but we do not create a likeness. We don't say Allah hears like humans do, or like bats do, or like, whatever, in the same way. No, we don't say that because we don't have any knowledge of that. But we understand what it means to hear, to perceive sounds, right? So we affirm that for Allah, right? And we don't make any resemblances. At the same time, we don't, in the process of negating any likeness, we don't exaggerate in that either, to the degree where we actually now end up negating the attribute altogether, right? So we don't say no one knows what the meaning of hearing is, and it's, we go to such negations that we actually negate the attribute itself, right? So even when we negate any likeness for Allah, we do it in the correct way, and when we affirm the attribute for Allah, we do it in the correct way, right? So we are neither falling into likening Allah with His creation, nor are we exaggerating in that until we actually negate the attribute altogether, right? Because as some people do, some people, for example, the people of Kalam, they will claim that Allah's attributes are metaphorical, they are allegorical, right? They are not real, right? It's like when you say, Ahmed is a lion. Ahmed is a lion. Now, he's not literally a lion. You just mean that he is ferocious and brave, but you don't mean he's a lion. But this is a metaphor, right? So some people say Allah's attributes, this is what it means, right? It doesn't mean that Allah actually hears. It just means that he has knowledge. It doesn't mean that Allah sees. It just means that Allah has knowledge of that thing. This is incorrect, because now you have explained away the attribute of hearing and the attribute of seeing. The attribute of hearing is other than the attribute of seeing, which is other than the attribute of knowing. These are all different attributes with different meanings, right? So you can't claim that they're just metaphorical and allegorical. This is the way of the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila. This is a mistake, and inshallah we will be looking at this in much more detail, later in this treatise. So, كما جمع الله تعالى بينهما, and it is Allah Azza wa Jal who combined between these two principles in this verse, which occurs in Surah Shura, which is the 42nd chapter, chapter 42, verse number 11. Chapter 42, verse number 11. This is a very important verse. In this verse, Allah Azza wa Jal, He said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, there is nothing which is a likeness to Him. There is nothing which is a likeness to Him. Now, if we stopped at this part of the verse, if we said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, and stopped there is nothing which is a likeness to Him, then someone might say, hold on, it's not possible for us to think of any attribute except that Allah cannot be like that. Right? Hearing, seeing, knowing, willing, wise, being pleased, being angry. Or you might think, oh well, hang on, laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing, Allah is not like anything, so therefore Allah must be free of all these things. Right? So if you stop there and you started thinking like that, then it means you would negate everything for Allah Azza wa Jal, because there's nothing which is a likeness for Him. However, in the very next sentence, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, and He is all hearing and all seeing. He hears and He sees. Right? So here Allah Azza wa Jal has combined between negation of likeness and affirmation of the attributes. So this now establishes that balance that we said before. We know that Allah knows, Allah hears, Allah sees, Allah has a will, Allah wills, Allah desires, Allah has irada, Allah has wisdom, hikmah, Allah becomes pleased, yarda wa yaghdab, He becomes angry, right? And so on and so forth. And we know the meanings of all these things, but we do not know the realities, right? So it is the realities for which there is no resemblance or likeness, right? There's no resemblance between Allah's hearing, Allah's seeing, and our hearing and our seeing. There's no resemblance in the realities, right? But as for the meaning of the attribute, what it means to hear, what it means to see, then yes, Allah hears and Allah sees, right? So as Ibn Taymiyyah explains, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. This is basically it's a negation of those people who make likenesses for Allah. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. It is an affirmation of His names and His attributes, and a refutation of the way of those people who basically explain away His attributes by tahrif, by distortion, by negation. Right? So what do? We affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself, and we negate for Allah whatever He negated from Himself, without distorting any of that, without negating any of that, without asking how is that, and without likening that to what we find in the creation. Right? This methodology right here, this sentence or these sentences that you've heard, that you've listened to, this is وَهَذَا هُوَ الْمَنْهُجُ السَّلِيمُ الْوَاجِبُ الْمَبْنِي عَلَى الْإِلْمِ وَالْحِكْمَةِ وَالسَّدَادِ فِي الْقَوْلِ وَالْإِعْتِقَادِ. He said this methodology here, this sound methodology, which is obligatory, it is built upon knowledge and wisdom and uprightness in speech and belief. Right? So this, what you've heard, these simple sentences, what you've heard, right? This is the foundation in this entire topic. If you stick to this, if you stick to these principles in this speech, then obviously there's further study and further detail to this as well. But this is the basic principle by which we oppose every other faction. We oppose the Jews. We oppose the Christians because they violate these principles. Right? This way was the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam. It was the way of Musa alayhi salam. It was the way of Isa alayhi salam. All the prophets and messengers are upon this methodology. All the revealed books which Allah sent down, from the Torah, the Injil, the scrolls of Abraham, the Zabur, the Psalms of David, all whatever Allah revealed, all of those books are upon this very principle right here. Right, which is founded upon the Quran. They are all built upon this principle when it comes to speech about Allah. So this is the way of ilm, wal hikmah, and wisdom, was sadad fil qawli wal i'tiqad, that this is the upright speech and belief. Walahu dalilan, it has two evidences, athari wa nadhari. And there are two evidences for this. One which is, text, and the other which is reason, an argument of reason. وَإِن شِئْتَ فَقُلْ سَمْعِي وَأَقْلِي. And if you want to say, it is evidence which is heard, which is revelation, and evidence which is aqli, which is rational and intellectual. Right? So, inshallah ta'ala, we will look at those two evidences for this principle in the next lesson, inshallah ta'ala. So just to round up then, what we've done today, what we've achieved so far, is that we've completed the introduction to the contents of the book, right? And how the book is divided into two sections: Allah's attributes and the issue of Allah's legislation and His decree. That's the second half of the book. The first half, so these are two obligations, right? With respect to the khabar and the talab. So you understand all that. Then we started the section on the attributes, and the very first thing that we've established is what is the basic underlying foundational principle that you and I and every Muslim, and in fact every believer, must speak about Allah and His attributes. This is the principle here. that we describe Allah only with what He described Himself. Which means that we affirm for Him what He affirmed for Himself, and we negate for Him what He negated for Himself. Which means by way of the khabar, the report that has come to us from Allah, from His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then as for the evidences, we'll look at that in the next lesson, inshallah ta'ala. So with that, we'll conclude today's session. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi.